Hi, I'm Emma, and this is Communist Histories. This is the beginning of what I'm planning to be a long series on the history of communism in China. I'm going to be discussing not just the events of the Chinese Revolution, but the people, ideas, and the material conditions that drove them, and what it all means for communists today. This history will be starting in 1911, which is a decade before communism becomes an important force in Chinese politics. But it's important for providing context for the Communist Party's eventual rise. And it'll still be very exciting. They don't call it the Warlord Era for nothing. At the turn of the 20th century, China was facing an existential crisis. It was ruled by the Qing dynasty, which overthrew China's previous dynasty, the Ming, in 1644. The Qing were Manchu, an ethnic group from the northeast of China which, after the conquest, made up less than 1% of the state's population. While there had been some major anti-Manchu rebellions in the decades just after the conquest, by the 18th century the Qing had consolidated power, and the majority Han Chinese population widely accepted having Manchu rulers. But after the British defeated China in the First Opium War, the perceived foreignness of the Qing dynasty became an easy scapegoat, and many Han began to blame the problems of the empire on its Manchu rulers. And there would be a lot of problems. Less than 10 years after the end of the Opium War, the Taiping Rebellion broke out, the largest civil war in history, in which anywhere from 20 to 100 million people died. During the rebellion, the British decided they hadn't gotten quite enough concessions out of the Opium War. So together with the French, they began the Second Opium War, which resulted in the burning of the Summer Palace in Beijing, and more trading rights and territorial concessions for Europeans in China. The Qing then faced a series of costly revolts in Xinjiang, and a famine that killed around 10 million people. In 1894, they were defeated by the Japanese and forced to pay 340 million taels of silver in war indemnities. Finally, in 1900, the six major powers of Europe, plus the US and Japan, invaded Beijing in response to the Boxer Rebellion, and forced the government to agree to pay 450 million taels of silver to them over the next 39 years. That's equal to about $10 billion today. The Qing dynasty was massively in debt, its army was in tatters, its territory was being encroached upon, and it was facing a rising nationalism that placed much of the blame on the Manchu emperors. And more, people were beginning to place the blame on the idea of an emperor itself. China was a powder keg, and it would just take one little explosion to set it off. The most important anti-Qing organization was founded in Tokyo in 1905. Tokyo was the place to go if you were a young Chinese radical looking to overthrow the government, or just get an education. It was a merger of a few different anti-Qing organizations, which had been founded in the previous decade, most notably the Revived China Society, led by Sun Zhongshan. Sun Zhongshan had a lot of names, most notably outside of China, Sun Yat-sen, but I'm going to be using Sun Zhongshan since that's what he's usually called in China. This new party was called the Tongmenghui, usually translated as Revolutionary Alliance, and its first leaders were Song Jioaren, Huang, and Sun Zhongshan. Sun was a Christian doctor from Guangdong, who became so disillusioned with the Qing dynasty that he quit his medical practice to become a revolutionary to save China. He made a name for himself through multiple failed uprisings, which required him to go into exile, but also made him a figurehead for the entire nationalist movement, which was a huge help as he set to his new task in Europe and America, fundraising, primarily among overseas Chinese immigrants. While in exile, he also developed his three principles of the people, San Min Chui, which would become the guiding principles of Chinese nationalism for the next 100 years. Nominally. These were nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. The de facto head of the Qing dynasty was the Dowager Empress Cixi. Cixi came to power as the regent for her 5-year-old son. Then, when he died at 18, his 4-year-old cousin became the Guangxu Emperor, with Cixi staying on as regent. When Guangxu finally grew up and officially took power for himself, he attempted to put through a series of radical reforms following the Sino-Japanese War. The conservative Qing court was alarmed by these proposed changes, and after 100 days they supported Cixi in a coup against Guangxu. The Guangxu emperor was put under house arrest, and Cixi returned to regency indefinitely. But she was not oblivious to the problems facing China, and in 1906 she finally put aside her conservatism and promised the people a constitution and restructuring of the government similar to the reforms of the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Unfortunately, before most of these reforms could be implemented, she died. One day after the Guangxu emperor died, probably by poisoning, possibly by being poisoned by Cixi herself, afraid that he would destroy her legacy if he took power after her. Whoever killed him, the successor to the throne ended up being the 2-year-old emperor Puyi. This didn't stop Cixi's reforms, since the new regents were just as aware of the empire's problems as she had been. But it did make them more contentious, since Han officials worried that the child emperor's Manchu advisors would have too much control over what form the reforms took. One of the first reforms enacted was the creation of provincial assemblies in 1909. These were regional democratic bodies, but they were only open to old, rich, educated men, and they didn't have a lot of power. They did successfully push for the convening of a provisional national assembly a year later, although it was mostly just advisory. The most controversial reform occurred in early 1911. The empire was still deeply in debt, and the government decided the best way to make money fast would be to nationalize the railroads. People freaked out. Now, this wasn't an issue of privatization versus socialization. Nobody cared about poor capitalists not being able to make money. This was an issue of centralization. The central government was seen as taking power from the provinces for itself. There were protests, rallies, and strikes all over the country. The new provincial assembly in Sichuan vowed to stop paying taxes. A member of the army cut off his finger in protest. And let's talk about the army. Traditionally, the Manchu army relied primarily upon the banner system. To vastly oversimplify, this was essentially a hereditary soldier caste that was very effective when the Manchu first conquered China, but by the 19th century was losing a lot of battles. So, after the humiliating defeats during the Sino-Japanese War and the Boxer Rebellion, the Qing created the new army, with a centralized command structure with new generals on top. The most influential of these generals was the reformer Yuan Shikai. Yuan became so popular with the Northern, or Beiyang army, that the government began to worry he might become too powerful. To head that off, in 1910 they informed him that he was very ill and should retire. Modern as it was, the new army was very expensive, and around the time of the railroad incident, the Qing had to raise taxes to help pay for it. Another very unpopular move. All of these factors converged here, in 1911, Wuhan. Wuhan is the largest city in central China, and in fact it is 3 cities, Wuchang, Hankou, and Hanyang. Wuhan was China's central railway hub. It had a large new army garrison. It was the center of a region that had recently experienced flooding and famine that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And it had many international concessions. That is, sections of the city were reluctantly given to the imperial powers during the 19th century. These were the perfect places for revolutionaries to hide out, since the Qing didn't police them, and the foreigners usually didn't care. On October 9th, Tongmenghui members in Hankou's Russian concession were building bombs for a future uprising, when one of them accidentally exploded. Qing authorities came to investigate the cause of this big explosion, and caught and executed the bomb makers. But more importantly, they found a roster of all Tongmenghui members in the city. The revolutionaries' focus in Wuhan had been infiltrating and converting the city's new army garrison. By October 1911, about 1/3 of local new army soldiers had joined or were sympathetic to the Tongmenghui. And the police now had a list of exactly who they were. Realizing that everyone was going to be arrested, the revolutionaries decided they may as well try to start the revolution now. On the morning of October 10th, commemorated as Double Ten Day in the Republic of China today, the Wuchang 8th Engineer Battalion mutinied, seizing the city's ammunition depot and quickly taking control of the city. The Manchu governor and the Han army commander fled the city. Other battalions followed suit, and 2 days later, all of Wuhan was under Tang Wenhui control. Unfortunately, due to the spontaneity of the revolution, there were no actual leaders of the Tang Wenhui around. Zhongshan was fundraising in the American Midwest, and Huang was in Shanghai. In the end, the revolutionaries chose Li and Huang to be their leader, at gunpoint. Li was not a revolutionary, but he was one of the highest-ranking new army officers who had stayed in the city rather than flee, and he was well liked by the troops. The Qing could already tell this uprising would be more trouble than any they'd had to deal with recently. So they called Yuan Shikai out of retirement, gave him back his army, and asked him to beat the rebels. He politely declined, but kept the army, and officially remained a loyal Qing general, albeit one who just wasn't capable of doing what the Qing wanted. By the end of October, provinces all over China had joined the revolt, and a senior general issued a list of demands to the government. A parliament and premier with real power. The emperor can't execute people. Manchus can't serve in the cabinet. The Qing agreed, and in November, Yuan Shikai, who had managed to play the middle enough not to be too offensive to anybody, was elected premier by the National Assembly. This was an acceptable outcome for many assembly members and generals, a real move towards constitutional monarchy. But it was not enough for the revolutionaries, who wanted to abolish the dynastic system altogether. So the fighting continued into December. The Tang Wenhui captured Nanjing, one of China's traditional capitals, and made it their headquarters. On Christmas Day, Zhongshan finally arrived back in China, and was immediately elected president of China by the representatives of the provincial assemblies in Nanjing, with Li Yunhong his vice president. There was now a very delicate status quo, with a constitutional monarchy in Beijing, supported by the National Assembly, and a republic in Nanjing, supported by a national council. By the end of January, though, the generals in Beijing realized that to gain the support of the people, they needed to get rid of the emperor. They made a deal with Puyi's family. The Qing could continue to live in the Forbidden City, with a stipend of $4 million a year, but would have no power. On February 12th, Puyi officially abdicated, granting all power to Yuan Shikai. The Xinhai Revolution was complete. Xinhai means metal pig, the year of the Chinese calendar these events took place. Zhongshan realized that Yuan's Beiyang army would be able to overpower the revolutionaries once his government was stabilized. After some deliberation, he accepted that a republican China was more important than his own rulership of it. He resigned his presidency and convinced the National Council to elect Yuan president. Sun took a job in Yuan's government as head of railway affairs. There was still the issue of two competing parliaments in the north and south, and Yuan reneged on his agreement to rule from Nanjing, away from his power base and army. But certainly these would be worked out peacefully, and a stable China would soon follow. Next time, we'll see just how well this arrangement worked out, as we discuss China's Second Revolution, which is spoiler enough already. If you'd like to learn more about what I talked about in this video, be sure to check the description, where I'll be listing some suggested books on the topic. I'm also planning on interspersing this series with some one-off videos about other events in the history of communism, so let me know in the comments if there's any particular topics you'd like me to cover. I'm planning on releasing new videos every 2 weeks, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any.